The sunlight streamed through the large glass panels of the main hall, cutting bright, geometric shapes across the polished floor. It was a Tuesday afternoon, which meant the air in the retirement home smelled faintly of lavender floor wax and brewed tea. The room was beginning to fill up with residents moving at their own careful paces. Some used walkers that squeaked rhythmically against the tiles, while others held onto the arms of staff members for support. Despite the slow movement, there was an energy in the room. It was the day of the weekly social gathering, the one time in the week where the chairs were arranged in a large circle, and tables were pushed aside to make space for conversation. At the far end of the room, standing apart from the clutter of tables and chairs, was the grand piano. It was a magnificent thing, shiny and black, reflecting the ceiling lights like a dark mirror. It looked impressive, dominating that corner of the hall, but in truth, it was mostly for show. Most weeks, it sat silent and covered in a thick layer of dust, acting as a shelf for a large vase of plastic lilies. Today, however, the vase had been moved. The lid was propped open, revealing the clean black and white keys. It was open because there was talk of a recital later that afternoon, a performance by a young student from the local music academy. The staff had spent the morning polishing the wood until it gleamed, eager to make a good impression. Arthur sat in his usual spot near the window, but he wasn't looking out at the garden. His eyes were fixed on the piano. He was 84 years old, a man with thinning white hair and a posture that had slowly curved forward over the years. To the nurses and the aides rushing back and forth with trays of cookies and pitchers of water, Arthur was just another resident. He was quiet, mostly keeping to himself, and often seemed to be staring off into space. They knew he had trouble remembering what day it was or sometimes even recognizing his own children when they visited. They assumed his mind was a foggy place where memories drifted like smoke, untouchable and vague. But Arthur's mind was not foggy, at least not about this. As he looked at the open piano, he felt a sudden, sharp pull in his chest. It felt like a physical ache, a need that started in his fingers and ran all the way up to his heart. He remembered the weight of those keys. He remembered the resistance they offered when you pressed them down firmly, the way the sound hammers would strike the strings inside to create a vibration that hummed through your bones. It had been decades since he had last sat at a proper instrument, but his body remembered. His hands, resting on the lap of his beige trousers, began to twitch involuntarily. His right thumb tapped gently against the fabric, playing a silent scale. Arthur made a decision. He pushed himself up from his armchair. His knees popped loudly, a sharp sound that made him grimace, but he ignored it. He grabbed his cane from the side of the chair and took a shaky breath. He felt a strange urgency bubbling up inside him, a desire to just touch the keys, to see if the magic was still there or if it had all been a dream. He began to walk toward the piano. It was a slow journey. He had to navigate around a small group of women who were discussing the price of knitting wool, and then carefully step over the leg of a man who was dozing in a recliner. Arthur's heart beat a little faster with every step. He felt like a man walking toward a long-lost love. He didn't have a plan to play a concert. He just wanted to feel the ivory under his fingertips one last time. He wanted to press a chord and hear the sound fill the room, if only for a second. As he got closer to the corner where the piano stood, a young woman in a blue uniform stepped into his path. It was Jessica, one of the newer caregivers. She was holding a clipboard and looked busy, her eyes darting around the room to make sure everyone had a glass of water. When she saw Arthur approaching the instrument, she didn't see a musician, she saw a confused old man wandering toward a piece of expensive furniture that he wasn't supposed to touch. "Whoops, hold on there, Arthur," Jessica said, her voice cheerful but firm. She stepped in front of him, blocking his way with a gentle hand on his forearm. "Where are we going in such a hurry?" Arthur stopped. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and earnest. He tried to explain, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He pointed a trembling finger toward the open keys. I just want to sit," Arthur stammered. His voice was thin and raspy. "For a moment. Just to feel it." Jessica smiled kindly, the way one smiles at a child who wants to touch a hot stove. "Oh, I know it looks tempting, Arthur. But Mr. Henderson is coming in later to play for us. We can't have anyone messing with the tuning before he gets here." She tightened her grip slightly on his arm, guiding him away from the bench. "Why don't you come sit by the window? It's lovely and sunny there. I'll bring you a biscuit." Arthur tried to hold his ground. He looked past her at the piano. The glistening black surface seemed to call to him. "Please," he whispered. "I know how. I won't break it. I promise." Jessica let out a soft, sympathetic sigh. She assumed he was confused. Many of the residents here thought they could do things they hadn't done in years: fly planes, run marathons, speak foreign languages. It was part of the illness, the staff had been told. Humoring them too much wasn't good, it just upset them when reality set in. "Now, Arthur, let's not be difficult," she said, her tone losing a fraction of its patience. She didn't want to make a scene in front of the other residents. "The piano is for the performer. It's not a toy. We don't want you to get frustrated trying to play and then not remembering how. That would just make you sad, wouldn't it?" Arthur felt the heat rising in his cheeks. He wanted to shout that he wasn't confused, that he knew exactly where he was and what that instrument was. He wanted to tell her that he had played in recitals when he was younger than she was, that he had taught his own children to read music on a battered upright in their living room. But looking at her face, he saw the wall. He saw that she had already decided who he was. To her, he was just a collection of medical needs and risks. He was someone to be managed, not listened to. The fight drained out of him as quickly as it had arrived. His shoulders slumped, and he lowered his hand. "Okay," he mumbled, the defeat heavy in his voice. "Okay. Good man," Jessica said brightly, relieved that the potential disruption had been avoided so easily. She steered him away from the corner. "Let's get you settled." She walked him back across the room, past the whispering groups and the clinking cups. She led him to a plush armchair that was angled toward the glass wall, facing away from the piano. It was a spot with a nice view, but it was isolated from the center of the action. "You sit tight here," Jessica said, patting his shoulder once he was down. "I'll be right back with that tea and a biscuit. Maybe some of that cake we saved from Sunday." Arthur sank into the soft cushions. He felt small. He watched Jessica walk away, her clipboard clutched to her chest, moving on to the next resident who needed something. He turned his head slowly and looked out the window. The garden outside was neat and organized, with rows of bright flowers that never seemed to wilt. It was perfect, but it was also very still. From his new seat, he could no longer see the piano. It was behind him now. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchenette and the low murmur of voices, but the silence of the instrument felt louder than anything else. He looked down at his hands in his lap. The skin was spotted with age, and the joints were swollen. They looked like the hands of an old man who had spent a lifetime doing hard labor, not the hands of a pianist. He flexed his fingers, feeling the stiffness in the knuckles. He remembered how it used to feel to play, the way the music would lift him out of his body, carrying him to a place where worries didn't exist. He remembered the look on his late wife's face when he would play her favorite song in the evenings after dinner. That connection, that ability to speak without words, was locked inside him somewhere, gathering dust just like the piano usually did. And now, because he was old, because his memory slipped sometimes, he wasn't allowed to touch it. He was treated like a child who didn't know any better. Arthur stared out at the sunlight hitting the lawn, his heart heavy. He wasn't angry at the girl, she was just doing her job, trying to keep things orderly. He was sad because he knew that in their eyes, he had lost his value. He was no longer the man who could create beauty, he was just the man who needed to be told where to sit. The potential for magic was still sitting inside him, waiting for a trigger, but for now, it was buried under a heavy blanket of assumptions and silence. He sat alone, waiting for his tea, while the piano sat empty in the corner, holding secrets that no one thought he knew anymore. Arthur sat in the plush armchair, the fabric feeling warm against his back, but his attention was entirely focused on what was happening behind him. He had turned his head as much as he could without looking obvious, staring at the reflection in the large glass window pane. Through the glare of the afternoon sun, he could see the blurry shapes moving around the grand piano. A young man, whom he hadn't seen before, was setting up a music stand. This was the performer, the talent the staff had been talking about all morning. From his spot by the window, Arthur felt like he was watching a play from which he had been unfairly banished. He watched the young man take a seat on the bench. He looked the part. He had messy hair tied back in a knot and wore a jacket with too many buttons. He opened a thick book of sheet music and poised his fingers over the keys. Arthur watched the boy's hands. They were loose and relaxed, but to Arthur's trained eye, they looked a bit unsure. The boy struck a chord. It was a loud, jarring sound meant to test the volume. Arthur flinched visibly. It wasn't a bad sound, but it lacked soul. It was just noise. The boy played a few scales, running up and down the keys with impressive speed. Arthur heard a few of the other residents clap politely. "Very talented," one woman whispered nearby. "So fast," another agreed. Arthur didn't say a word. He didn't want to be rude, but he knew that speed wasn't everything. He could hear the hesitation between the notes. The boy was thinking about where his fingers were going, rather than feeling the music. To Arthur, it sounded like a typewriter going at full speed, efficient and mechanical, but empty. It was all technique and no heart. Inside, Arthur felt a burning frustration. He wanted to stand up and explain the difference between playing the notes and playing the music. He wanted to tell them that the piano was a living thing that breathed, and you had to listen to it. But he stayed silent. He looked down at his own hands resting on his knees. They were pale, the skin thin like parchment paper, with blue veins running just beneath the surface. The knuckles were swollen and stiff. He tried to wiggle his pinky finger, and it moved, but slowly, like a rusty hinge. It was hard to believe that these hands were once capable of creating storms and whispers on the ivory keys. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds from the room fade into the background, and let his own memories take over. Suddenly, he wasn't in the retirement home anymore. He was back in his old house, 50 years ago. The room was dark, lit only by the amber glow of a street lamp outside the window. He was sitting at their old upright piano. It was a beat-up thing, a few of the keys chipped, the wood scratched, but to him, it was a treasure. He remembered the smell of the room lemon polish and the faint scent of his wife's perfume. She used to sit in the rocking chair just behind him, knitting while he played. He remembered one specific evening, a Tuesday much like today, when he had been practicing Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21. He had been struggling with a specific passage, a run of notes that just wouldn't flow smoothly. He had played it over and over, getting more and more annoyed with himself. Then, his wife had walked over. She hadn't said a word. She just placed her hand gently on his shoulder, squeezing it tight. "You're thinking too hard," she had whispered. "Just let it go, Arthur. Play it for me." He had taken a deep breath, closed his eyes, and stopped trying to control every finger. He had just let his hands do what they knew how to do. The music had poured out of him, perfect and fluid. He remembered the feeling of the air vibrating around him, the way the music seemed to lift the heavy atmosphere of the room, replacing it with something pure and beautiful. He remembered looking back at her and seeing her smile, her eyes wet with happy tears. That connection, that moment of pure understanding between them without a single word being spoken, was the most real thing he had ever known. The memory was so vivid that Arthur almost expected to smell her perfume when he inhaled. But instead, he smelled floor wax and tea. He opened his eyes, and the vision of his old living room shattered. He was back in the present. The young man at the piano was playing something fast and complicated now. The other residents were watching, nodding their heads in time, seemingly entertained. But Arthur felt a deep sense of loneliness settle over him like a heavy blanket. It was a loneliness that had nothing to do with being alone in a room. It was the loneliness of having something precious inside you that no one else could see. He watched the staff members buzzing around, checking their clipboards, adjusting the blinds, and pouring water. They looked at the residents, and they saw patients. They saw people who needed care, people who were frail and forgetful. They didn't see Arthur as a man who had once held a room spellbound with a melody. They didn't see the decades of passion and discipline stored in his muscle memory. They just saw a confused old man who needed to be kept away from the expensive instrument. Arthur tapped his foot on the carpet. It was a soft, involuntary rhythm. He was unconsciously keeping time with the music the boy was playing, but he was adding a rubato, a slight speeding up and slowing down that the boy wasn't playing. In Arthur's mind, he was correcting the performance. He was filling in the gaps that the boy was missing. It was a tragic irony. While the boy was the one touching the keys, Arthur was the one making the music real. The boy had the hands, but Arthur had the soul. He thought about getting up again. He thought about walking over there and asking if he could just play one song. He wondered if he could convince them. He could explain that he used to be a professional. He could tell them about the conservatory, the recitals, the years of teaching. But the fear of rejection stopped him. He couldn't bear the look of pity in Jessica's eyes again. He couldn't bear being humiliated, being dragged away from the bench like a naughty toddler. It was better to suffer in silence than to have his dignity stripped away in front of everyone. So, he sat there, a prisoner in his chair. He watched the dust motes dancing in the shaft of sunlight coming through the window, drifting aimlessly without direction. He felt exactly like those dust motes. He felt disconnected, floating through the air without a purpose, waiting to settle somewhere and be forgotten. The music in the room was just sound. It wasn't the magic he remembered. The magic was locked inside him, screaming to get out, but it had nowhere to go. Arthur looked around the room at the other people. Some were sleeping with their mouths open. Others were staring blankly at the walls. How many of them, he wondered, were holding on to similar secrets? How many of them were brilliant minds trapped in failing bodies, poets who couldn't speak, artists who couldn't hold a brush? The world was in such a hurry to move forward, to celebrate the young and the new, that it often forgot to listen to the old. It assumed that because the machinery was wearing out, the person inside was gone too. He let out a long, shaky breath that rattled in his chest. The young pianist finished his piece with a dramatic flourish, lifting his hands high in the air. The room applauded politely. Arthur didn't clap. He just looked at his hands again. He curled his fingers inward, pressing them against his palms. He could almost feel the keys. He could almost hear the clear, resonant chord of C major. It was so close he could taste it. He closed his eyes once more, drifting away from the noise, retreating into the quiet symphony in his mind where he was still whole, where he was still Arthur the musician, and not just Arthur the resident in the chair by the window. The atmosphere in the room began to change as the clock on the wall ticked closer to the hour of the actual performance. The casual chatter died down, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Staff members moved through the rows of chairs, handing out printed programs that listed the pieces to be played. The residents held the papers with care, adjusting their glasses and squinting at the fancy font. It felt like a special occasion, a break from the monotony of card games and television shows. The air seemed to vibrate with the expectation of being entertained. Arthur sat in his chair, the program resting unopened on his lap. He watched the main entrance with a feeling of dread mixed with curiosity. He didn't care about the fancy titles of the songs, nor did he care about the reputation of the young man who was now checking his phone nervously backstage. Arthur just wanted the ordeal to be over, or perhaps, secretly, he was waiting for a miracle. He was waiting for someone to look at him, really look at him, and see the musician sitting beneath the wrinkles. The pianist, whose name was printed in bold letters at the top of the program, walked out to a smattering of applause. He sat down on the bench, adjusted his height, and cracked his knuckles. He looked confident, ready to impress. He placed his hands on the keys and launched into a complex classical piece. The notes filled the room, loud and clear. Arthur watched the boy's hands fly up and down the keyboard. It was impressive to see such young fingers move so fast, like spiders darting across a web. But as Arthur listened, his brow furrowed. It wasn't right. The speed was there, but the emotion was flat. It was like listening to a robot recite a poem. Every word was pronounced correctly, but there was no understanding behind the words. Then, about 10 minutes into the performance, something happened. The young man was in the middle of a difficult run, his left hand jumping rapidly across the lower keys while his right hand played the melody high above. Suddenly, his hand jerked awkwardly. He hit a wrong note, a jarring discord that cut through the music like a knife. He tried to correct it, sliding his fingers back into position, but his face twisted in a wince of pain. He slowed down, trying to compensate for the sudden stiffness in his wrist, but the damage was done. The flow was broken. The music stopped abruptly. The young man sat there for a moment, his hands hovering over the keys, shaking his left hand as if he had touched a hot stove. He stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment, and muttered an apology to the room. The residents looked at each other in confusion. Was this part of the show? The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. The magic of the event had popped, leaving behind an awkward reality. Brenda, the woman in charge of activities, rushed over from the side of the room where she had been standing with her arms crossed. She looked concerned, speaking to the pianist in hushed tones that carried across the quiet room. Arthur, whose hearing was still sharp when he wanted it to be, caught bits of the conversation. "It's just seized up," the young man said, clutching his wrist, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't flex my fingers. It hurts too much to put any pressure on it. I tried to warm up, but it's no use. Brenda looked out at the sea of expectant faces. There were 50 people sitting there, waiting for music. They had rearranged their schedules, skipped their naps, and put on their best clothes for this hour. Canceling wasn't just about the music, it was about letting them down. She looked back at the pianist. Is there anything else, something slower, maybe just one song? The young man shook his head, looking miserable. I can't even make a fist, let alone play a chord. I'm sorry. I need to go put ice on it. He gathered his sheet music, stuffing the papers into his bag with trembling hands, and walked quickly toward the exit, leaving the piano standing alone and silent on the stage. Brenda turned to face the room. She forced a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She clapped her hands together to get everyone's attention. Well, folks, it seems we have a little medical emergency with our performer. He isn't feeling well, so we are going to have to cut the recital short. Thank you all for coming, though. Let's give him a hand for trying. The applause was weak and scattered. It was the kind of applause people give when they feel sorry for someone. Almost immediately, the mood in the room shifted from excitement to disappointment. People began to shuffle in their seats. A few heads shook. This was the highlight of their week, and now it was over before it had really begun. The loneliness that Arthur had felt earlier seemed to spread through the group like a cold draft. They had been promised a break from their quiet lives, and now they were being sent back to the silence. Arthur watched Brenda stand by the piano, looking at her phone, probably scrolling through a list of contacts, trying to figure out what to do next. She looked frantic. She knew how much these events meant to the morale of the home. Without the music, the afternoon just felt like a Tuesday afternoon again, long, empty, and gray. He looked around at the other residents. He saw Mrs. Gable, a woman who rarely spoke, staring sadly at the empty bench. He saw Mr. Henderson, who usually slept through everything, looking wide awake and waiting for the sound to start again. They wanted the music. It wasn't just about entertainment, it was about feeling something real. It was about being transported out of that building, even if just for 20 minutes. They were hungry for it, and now the cupboard was bare. Arthur felt a strange sensation bubbling up in his chest. It wasn't just pity for them, it was a desire to fix it. He looked at his hands again. He flexed the fingers. The stiffness was still there, the arthritis was a constant dull ache in his joints, but he realized something important. He didn't need to play fast runs or complex jumps. He didn't need to show off. He knew the songs they loved. He knew the melodies that made people remember their own childhoods, their weddings, and their happier days. He knew how to play simply, with feeling. He knew how to make the piano sing. He watched Brenda as she put her phone away, defeated. There was no one else to call. The silence stretched out, threatening to ruin the entire afternoon. The air in the room felt heavy, waiting for someone to make a move. Arthur took a deep breath. He knew that if he spoke up, he risked being humiliated. He risked being told to sit down and behave like a child. He risked the pity of Jessica and the confusion of the staff. But as he looked at the disappointed faces of his friends, his neighbors, his fellow travelers in this final stage of life, he realized that his dignity wasn't as important as their joy. He didn't want to be the invisible man in the chair anymore. He wanted to be Arthur again. He wanted to be the person who could make the room light up. The fear was still there, chewing at the edges of his mind, but the urge to create was stronger. It was a fire that had been smoldering for years, and the sudden absence of the other performer had blown on the embers until they roared to life. He gripped the arms of his chair. His palms were sweating. He pushed himself up, his knees protesting with a sharp pop. He stood for a moment, waiting for the room to stop spinning. He was just an old man in a beige cardigan, standing in a room full of old people. He looked small. But as he looked at that big, black piano waiting in the corner, he didn't feel small. He felt like he was the only one in the room who knew exactly what needed to be done. He began to take his first step away from the safety of the window, toward the center of the room, leaving the loneliness behind him with every shuffle of his feet. The walk from the window to the front of the room felt like the longest journey Arthur had ever taken. It was only a distance of maybe 20 yards, but with every step, his body seemed to grow heavier. The carpet was thick, grabbing at the rubber tips of his cane, dragging his feet down. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the exertion, but from a terrifying mix of adrenaline and fear. He could feel the eyes of the room turning toward him. The quiet murmurs of conversation stopped one by one as people noticed the old man moving against the flow, making his way toward the stage rather than the exit. Brenda was still standing by the piano, looking down at her phone with a frown, scrolling frantically through a list of contacts that offered no hope. She didn't notice Arthur approaching until he was just a few feet away. When she finally looked up, her eyes went wide with surprise. She didn't see a musician walking toward her, she saw a confused resident wandering out of his designated zone. Her instinct was to protect him and to maintain order. "Arthur," she said, her voice sharp with surprise but edged with that familiar caregiver condescension. "What are you doing up here, hon? You're supposed to be sitting by the window. Is everything okay? Do you need to use the restroom?" She reached out a hand to gently guide him back toward the safety of the chairs, her movements practiced and efficient. It was the same move she used on everyone who got a little too close to the kitchen or tried to leave through the wrong entrance. Arthur stopped her hand with a gesture that was surprisingly firm for a man of his age. He didn't grab her, but he raised his own palm, a silent signal to stop. He looked her right in the eye, and for a second, the confusion she expected to see wasn't there. Instead, she saw a flash of intense clarity. "I can play," Arthur said. His voice was raspy and thin, lacking the volume it once had, but the words were distinct. He enunciated them carefully, desperate to be understood. "I know the instrument. I can play for them." Brenda blinked, caught off guard. She let out a short, nervous laugh, looking around the room to see if anyone else was watching this awkward interaction. "Oh, Arthur, that's very sweet of you to offer, but we can't have that. It's a professional piano. And you need to sit down now. Please, let's not make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," Arthur said, his voice trembling slightly. He tightened his grip on his cane. "I saw the boy. He couldn't move his hand. The people are waiting. They want the music. I can give them the music." Behind him, he could hear the shuffling of feet and the low hum of whispers. The other residents were watching. They knew Arthur. They saw him every day eating soup and staring at the walls. They didn't see a concert pianist. They saw the quiet old man who forgot names. Arthur could feel their skepticism like a physical weight. If he backed down now, he would just be the crazy man who thought he could play. If he went forward, he risked proving them right. Jessica, the caregiver from earlier, hurried over, alerted by the commotion. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, stepping in beside Brenda. She looked at Arthur with a mix of annoyance and concern. "Arthur, you know you aren't supposed to be up here. Come on, let's get you back to your chair. I'll get you some of that cake we talked about." The two women closed in around him, forming a wall of polite refusal. They were doing their jobs. They were protecting the facility, the schedule, and the resident. They couldn't see that by protecting him, they were smothering the last spark of life he had left. Arthur stood his ground. He felt a sudden surge of defiance. He was tired of being managed. He was tired of being treated like a child who didn't know his own mind. He looked at the empty bench, the glossy black wood shining under the lights. It was so close. "Please," Arthur said, the word cracking in his throat. He looked at Brenda, really pleading with her. "Just one song. If it's bad, I'll stop. I promise. But don't let them sit there in the silence." Brenda looked at the crowd of residents. They were indeed restless. The disappointment was palpable, people were gathering their things to leave. The afternoon was ruined, and she had no backup plan. She looked back at Arthur. He was trembling, his hands shaking visibly, his knuckles swollen. Logic told her this was a terrible idea. It was a liability risk. It was embarrassing. But there was something in his eyes, a desperate, burning intensity that gave her pause. She looked at the empty piano, then at the crowd, and finally back at Arthur. She was tired too. Tired of the routine, tired of the disappointment. And maybe, just maybe, a small part of her wanted to see what would happen. I don't know, Arthur," Brenda hesitated, biting her lip. "It's been so long." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Arthur lied. He was terrified. But he knew he had to try. Jessica started to object, stepping forward to take his arm again, but Brenda held up a hand to stop her. "Wait," Brenda said softly. She looked at Jessica. "Let him try. What's the harm? The show is cancelled anyway." Jessica looked shocked. "But, the rules. And his condition. What if he gets confused or hurts himself?" "He won't hurt himself," Brenda said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "And if he plays one note and stops, we just lead him back. It's better than nothing." She turned to Arthur and took a deep breath, stepping aside to clear the path to the bench. "Okay, Arthur. You can try. But just for a minute. And be gentle with the keys." Arthur felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." He shuffled past them, leaning heavily on his cane. The distance to the bench seemed to shrink. He reached the instrument and stood before it, looming over the keys. It smelled of lemon polish and dust. It was beautiful. He fumbled with his cane, trying to figure out where to put it, and Jessica quickly stepped in to take it from him. She set it aside, watching him closely, ready to snatch him back at the first sign of trouble. Arthur turned around and lowered himself onto the bench. It was harder than he remembered. His joints creaked, and his balance was precarious. He had to wiggle a bit to get comfortable. The bench felt hard and cold. He was facing the room now. 50 faces were staring back at him. Some looked confused, some looked amused, and some just looked bored. He saw Mrs. Gable in the front row, her head cocked to the side, waiting. He placed his hands on his knees for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady his racing heart. He looked down at the keyboard. The white keys stretched out like an endless snowy road, the black keys like jagged mountains. He lifted his hands. They were shaking badly. The tremor was worse now that he was in the spotlight. He felt a wave of panic. What if he had forgotten? What if his fingers were too stiff? What if the first note sounded terrible? He looked out at the room, and for a second, he wanted to stand up and run back to his chair. He wanted to hide. He felt small and foolish. But then he closed his eyes. He blocked out the bright lights, the whispering staff, and the skeptical residents. He remembered his wife's hand on his shoulder. He remembered the smell of the old living room. He remembered the feeling of the music flowing through him. He was just a vessel. The music wasn't in his head, it was in his hands. It was in his blood. He didn't need to force it. He just needed to let it out. Arthur stopped fighting the shake in his hands. He let his fingers hover over the keys, finding the familiar position of a C chord. The room was dead silent. The air conditioning hummed quietly. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what the old man would do. He didn't press down immediately. He waited for a moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the expectation. He exhaled slowly, pushing all the fear and doubt out of his body with that breath. Then, with a gentleness that surprised even him, Arthur let his fingers drop. The moment Arthur's fingers made contact with the keys, the world seemed to stop. He didn't hit them hard, he caressed them, letting the weight of his arms do the work. The first chord that rang out wasn't shaky or timid. It was deep, rich, and resonant. It filled the large hall with a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up the legs of the chairs. It was a C major chord, but it wasn't just a note, it was a statement. It was a voice speaking up after decades of silence. Arthur didn't hesitate. As soon as the sound began to fade, his right hand moved. For the first few seconds, there was a collective gasp from the staff, who expected to hear random banging or a childlike nursery rhyme. But what came out of the instrument was a melody that was complex, flowing, and precise. It was Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21, the same piece he had played in his living room 50 years ago. His fingers, which had been trembling so badly just moments ago while resting on his knees, suddenly found a life of their own. The tremor vanished. The stiffness in his joints seemed to melt away under the heat of the music. It was as if a switch had been flipped in his brain. The part of him that was old, frail, and confused was pushed to the back, and the musician took over. His eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to the right, and his hands danced across the keys. It wasn't the flashy, fast playing of the young student who had left earlier. This was different. It had a swing to it, a gentle rise and fall that felt like breathing. He wasn't just playing the notes written on a page, he was telling a story. The music was conversational, sometimes soft and whispering, sometimes loud and commanding, but always controlled. In the front row, Brenda stood frozen. Her arms were still crossed, but her hands were gripping her elbows tightly. She stared at Arthur with her mouth slightly open. She looked from his face, which was peaceful and focused, down to his hands, which were moving with a speed and agility she didn't think possible for a man his age. She glanced at Jessica, who was standing a few feet away with a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. The confusion on their faces was slowly being replaced by awe. They realized they weren't watching a confused old man having a breakdown, they were witnessing a master at work. The effect on the other residents was even more profound. The restlessness, the shuffling feet, and the sounds of people preparing to leave had all vanished. The room was transfixed. Mrs. Gable, who usually sat with her head down, had lifted her chin and was staring at the piano, her eyes fixed on Arthur's hands. Mr. Henderson, who rarely spoke or moved, was tapping his foot in perfect time with the beat. The music seemed to reach past their clouded memories and their failing bodies, speaking to them in a language they still understood. As Arthur played, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. The sterile smell of floor wax and medicine seemed to be pushed out by the emotional weight of the melody. It felt as though a window had been opened on a stuffy day, letting in fresh air. The sound of the piano was so full and warm that it made the room feel smaller, cozier, like a home. It erased the clinical feeling of the institution for a few precious minutes. Arthur was lost in the music. He didn't hear the silence of the crowd. He didn't see the staff staring. In his mind, he was back in his prime. He could feel the smooth ivory keys, the resistance of the pedals under his feet as he pressed them down to extend the sound. He remembered the feeling of his wife's presence, and he played for her now. He put all the love he had stored up over the years into the phrasing. He put his loneliness into the slow, sad parts, and his joy into the fast, running notes. It was a release. It was the most honest thing he had done in a long time. The piece built up to a crescendo, the notes tumbling over each other like a waterfall of sound. Arthur's hands moved faster now, his left hand jumping confidently to create the rhythm while his right hand soared above. There were no mistakes. There was no hesitation. It was perfect, not because it was technically flawless, but because it was filled with emotion. Every note meant something. When he finally hit the final chords and let his hands lift off the keys, the sound lingered in the air, vibrating against the walls and the ceiling. Arthur sat there, his chest heaving slightly, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He kept his eyes closed for a moment, not wanting to let go of the feeling, not wanting to return to the quiet room. Then, he opened his eyes. For a second, there was total silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when something so beautiful has occurred that people are afraid to break it with noise. But then, Mrs. Gable began to clap. She started slowly, but with enthusiasm. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause they had given the young student earlier. It was loud, raucous, and genuine. People were whistling, some were standing up, and others were wiping tears from their eyes. Brenda rushed forward, but not to stop him. She was beaming, her face flushed with excitement. "Arthur!" she exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. That was beautiful. I had no idea." Jessica was there too, looking a little sheepish but smiling broadly. "I've never heard anything like that," she said softly to him. "You really can play." Arthur looked at them, and for the first time, he didn't see caretakers who thought he was a burden. He saw people who recognized him. He saw respect in their eyes. The invisible wall that had separated him from the rest of the world was gone. He turned his head to look at the other residents. They were smiling at him, nodding, clapping. He wasn't just the old man by the window anymore. He was Arthur the pianist. He was a person who had given them a gift. A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. It reached his eyes, which were sparkling with tears of joy. He felt a lightness in his chest that had been missing for years. The loneliness, the frustration, and the feeling of invisibility had all been washed away by the music. He knew that tomorrow he might go back to being just a resident who needed reminders to eat his dinner. He knew his hands might shake again when he wasn't touching the keys. But for now, in this moment, he was seen. He was heard. And he knew that the magic hadn't left him. It had been waiting inside him all along, just needing the courage to come out. He carefully placed his hands back on his knees, exhausted but deeply content. The applause continued to wash over him like a warm wave, and he closed his eyes again, letting the sound fill him up, holding on to the memory of this moment, knowing it would be enough to last him a lifetime.